Welcome to Stories Room. Enjoy listening and don't forget to subscribe. It was late evening, and thin rays of the setting sun peeked through the gaps in the curtains, casting long shadows on the wall. Mark sat in the living room on an old, threadbare couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, barely noticing the flickering images. His thoughts were far from the noisy comedy show on the screen. For the past few months, he had felt an uneasy tension, like tiny shards of glass cutting under his skin, robbing him of peace. This anxiety was tied to his wife, Alice. He had known her for 10 years, and for most of that time, she had seemed the embodiment of reliability and sincerity. But over the last few weeks, Alice's behavior had changed. She used to be home by dinner, and they would sit together, sip tea, discuss work, plan vacations. Now she left earlier than usual, came back much later, and spent her evenings absorbed in her phone. Although she tried to answer questions calmly, her voice carried a frosty edge, and when he asked what was happening, she gave vague replies about overtime or urgent things with friends, avoiding his eyes. Mark sensed how a strange anger was building inside him. The mounting suspicions nagged at him day and night. He tried telling himself that Alice was just going through a rough patch at work, that she was exhausted or temporarily distracted by personal worries. But as he caught her more than once hiding her phone or walking off to another room to take a call, an unsettling certainty grew in his mind. She was lying. That evening, Alice was in the bedroom packing her things. She had announced she would be gone for a week, supposedly visiting a friend in the next town. Mark didn't know whether to bring up his suspicions directly or stay silent, continuing to play the role of a passive observer. But the fear and resentment he felt were overwhelming. Their life hung in the balance. Finally, he made up his mind. Ascending the stairs, Mark approached the slightly open bedroom door. Through the narrow gap, he saw Alice, lips pressed tight, carefully placing inside her suitcase inverted clothes, neatly folded shirts, and a cosmetic pouch. Her hands were trembling, as though she was torn between nervous tension and a desire to finish packing as quickly as possible. "Are you really sure you need to leave for the entire week?" he asked quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Alice flinched at his voice, but quickly composed herself without turning around. "Mark, I've already explained. I need a change of scenery. I'm tired. I need a break." His heart tightened under the weight of his suspicions. He knew her response was rehearsed. He had heard it many times before, but until now, he'd hesitated to press her directly. At this moment, he could no longer keep it inside. "You've never gone away on your own for this long," Mark went on, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's at least strange. I have a right to know what's going on." Finally, Alice turned around. Her gaze was cold, like a stranger's. "Mark, I'm not a child. I don't need anyone's approval to go off for a few days alone. It's my personal time, and I'm using it." Her words cut him to the quick. Mark had always tried to be an understanding husband, giving her freedom and supporting her career ambitions. But he realized she was barely listening to him now. She had made up her mind. Then he noticed something unusual poking out of the suitcase, a flashy, short costume in shiny fabric and a police cap. It was quite a revealing outfit, hardly the sort of thing you'd take for a modest trip to a friend's place. "What's this?" Mark asked, stepping closer and pulling out the outfit into the light. Alice glanced at it and shrugged, forcing herself to maintain a confident air. "It's just a silly party outfit. There'll be a girls' night, some costume fun." Yet Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. His apprehension morphed into righteous anger in an instant. A costume party? Dressed as a police officer in a skimpy mini? His voice trembled. "Alice, who are you trying to fool?" She crossed her arms, looking uneasy. "Oh God, Mark, it's just a joke. You're making a big deal out of nothing." His eyes clouded with fury. "If you walk out of this house with that costume in your suitcase, I. The words stuck in his throat. He couldn't believe he was saying something like that to his wife, but jealousy and pain forced him to the brink of losing control. Alice, on the contrary, raised an eyebrow and suddenly smirked. "You can't stop me. Understand that I'm a person with my own desires. I have a lover," she fired off, as if throwing a grenade at his feet. "And, by the way, he's waiting for me in the car outside." Mark's heart seemed to skip a beat. The world around him lost its color. He had feared this, But hearing her confirm it, hearing that cynical, "I have a lover," was too much. He couldn't even form a reply. His body responded on its own. He turned and ran downstairs. On the porch stood a fit, confident-looking man, leaning casually against his car, completely unprepared for the enraged husband who now approached. "You," Mark growled, stepping up in 2 strides and yanking the collar of the stranger's jacket. "You'll pay for this." The man gasped, dropping his cigarette on the pavement. Fear flashed in his eyes, but he managed to recoil slightly. Mark, filled with desperation and rage, practically dragged him off the porch, back into the house, where the air felt heavy with tension and deceit. Alice followed behind, shouting for Mark to stop. Inside the living room, Mark took out all his pent-up rage on the man, named Derek, as he would later learn. His fists slammed down repeatedly. Derek tried to defend himself, holding up his arms in desperation, but Mark's strength was fueled by heartbreak. Panicked cries echoed as Derek collapsed to the floor, Mark on top of him, delivering furious blows. Alice seized Mark by the arm, begging him to stop, only to be met with a savage glare. "Get off, or do you want me to?" Alice shrank back, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. Finally, Mark paused. His breathing was ragged, and his fists dripped blood. Derek lay there, bruised and trembling, his face swelling into a mess of cuts. Through the blood and bruises, he gasped, "I didn't know she was married. I truly didn't." Mark clenched his teeth. "Liar. And even if it's true, now you know." Alice was sobbing in a corner by the wall, tears streaming as she cried out in desperation. "Mark, you'll kill him. Stop." He felt his heart pounding as if it might burst from his chest. The adrenaline and rage mixed with a wave of emptiness. He stood up, stepping away from Derek. His gaze fell on the police cap Alice had been about to pack. He snatched it and hurled it at her feet. "Go ahead and play dress up if you want," he said with bitter sarcasm. "Let the cops come and take you both." He grabbed the phone off the wall, dialing the police with a curt message that his wife and her friend were in the house and that there'd been a fight. Alice ran toward him in terror. "Why are you calling the police?" "Don't do that." "I have to," Mark whispered. "People need to see what you are. Let them see who you've become." He was on the edge, unable to stop. Anger overshadowed reason. He wanted her world, everything she'd so easily destroyed, to crumble. Once he finished the call, he ran upstairs, stuffing essentials into a small bag: passport, clothes, laptop, money, whatever he deemed necessary. A final, forlorn look around the half-empty bedroom. It had once been filled with love. Now it was the setting for a grim finale. From downstairs came Derek's pained moans and Alice's sobs. Mark wanted no part of that. He stepped past her without a word. She looked up at him, pleading, "Stop, please. Mark, we can fix this." He slammed the front door behind him. Adrenaline still hammered in his ears, and his soul was filled with a cold fury. In the distance, he heard sirens. Mark started his car, pressing the gas pedal to the floor, fleeing from everything he had once believed in. He drove several blocks before pulling over, realizing his hands were still shaking. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of his own distorted expression, pain and rage intertwined. Then he started the engine again, heading out of town on the highway that led to the airport. Throughout the drive, his mind reeled with flashbacks. Derek on the floor, Alice with the police cap in her hands, her tears. Each mental image confirmed the depth of her betrayal. At the airport, Mark took the first flight he could find to a small tropical resort island. He barely thought it through, just bought a one-way ticket. A small backpack on his shoulders, exhausted eyes, bloody knuckles. This was his only luggage for a new life. The plane ascended into the night sky, carrying him far from the sirens and the shattered home he left behind. Slouched in his seat, Mark tried to sleep. But when he closed his eyes, he replayed the memory of Alice's mocking confession that she had a lover. Her words, "He's waiting in the car," echoed in his ears. He felt like a man who had lost everything in one unbearable moment. By the time the plane landed, sunlight poured through the windows. Warm ocean air greeted him as he stepped onto the tarmac of a small provincial airport. It felt as if nature itself had offered him a hand of solace, hoping to soothe his raw soul. He flagged down a taxi and asked the driver to take him to the quietest beach spot around. Palm trees, sandy beaches, and crystal-clear water. This tropical island looked like something from an advertisement, an idyllic place seemingly untouched by the tragedies of the wider world. Mark rented a modest bungalow from an old fisherman named George, who handed him the key without question, not asking who he was or where he came from. Mark sensed that here, far from civilization, he could hide and let his wounds heal. For days, he did little except sit on the shore, greeting sunrises and watching sunsets. He stayed by the water's edge, letting the waves lap at his feet, staring as the tranquil clouds drifted across the sky. At times, the noise in his head subsided. Other times, it roared back, conjuring up visions of Alice and that final night of chaos. He often woke in the bungalow in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He'd dream of the fight. He was again pummeling Derek, feeling the impact of his fists, seeing blood on his knuckles, with Alice begging him to stop, yet he couldn't or wouldn't. One morning, Mark got up and found himself staring in the bathroom mirror. An alien figure gazed back at him. Who have I become? How could I succumb to such savage rage? Weeks passed, then another. He began chatting with locals. George showed him how to fish and fix nets. Mark helped tend the garden by the bungalow. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the island's wind and sun drew out some of his hurt and anger. Yet any reminder of the past could awaken in him a wave of hatred and regret. In the evenings, he read books beneath the whir of an old ceiling fan. The island was nearly silent, and time passed slowly. He tried not to think about what had happened, though the nightmares still came, albeit less often. Lying in a hammock outside, he watched stars fill the sky, losing himself in endless space, as if seeking answers no one could give. One day, while buying fruit at the local market, a young Canadian tourist named Andrew struck up a conversation with him. Somehow, Mark found himself unloading his story about his wife's betrayal and the rampage he'd caused. Without going into the gory details, he confessed that he had fled because he saw no other way out. Andrew, listening sympathetically, suggested Mark see a psychologist. There aren't many specialists here, but there's a tiny medical center in the main town. If it's really hard for you, don't hesitate. Mark had never considered counseling, but the idea stuck in his mind. A few days later, he mustered the courage to visit the center. A kindly older woman named Mary admitted him without an appointment, seeing how distressed he looked. The session was uncomfortable. Mark, for the first time putting it all into words, felt shame, bitterness, and cold anger. He recounted Alice's betrayal, his violent outburst, the sense that he had lost control of himself. Mary listened intently, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. By the end, he felt as if he had shed a heavy weight. Still, complete relief eluded him. He knew he'd run away, leaving behind not just his wife but all the unresolved chaos. Where was Alice now? What had become of her? How had she dealt with his departure and the police arriving? All these questions continued to haunt him. Mark spent nearly 6 months on the island. That was long enough to learn to smile occasionally at strangers and to sleep through the night without waking up in terror. He even acquired a few bookshelves and some household items for his bungalow. But one morning, gazing at the sea, he realized, I can't hide here forever. His past remained unfinished. After informing George he was leaving, Mark packed his belongings and returned to the mainland. He had no set plan, but he knew he had to close this chapter of his life or it would follow him forever. When Mark returned to the city, it felt oddly unreal. Familiar streets, cafes, billboards, all looked deceptively normal, as if they had forgotten him. Meanwhile, he felt like a stranger in a place where he once belonged. He rented a small apartment on the outskirts, far from the neighborhood he and Alice had shared. Over the next few days, he busied himself settling in and searching for a new job. He wanted to avoid old contacts, fearing their questions and his own shame. Yet only a week later, he bumped into an old friend, Aaron, at the supermarket. Shocked to see Mark, Aaron invited him for coffee at a nearby shop. Everyone was looking for you, Aaron said in a conspiratorial whisper. Alice filed a missing persons report, then retracted it. People said you had a meltdown and bashed some guy's face in. They only whispered about it. Alice disappeared from view as well, went to live with her sister. Your house went up for sale a few months ago, but no one dared to buy. Mark felt his heart twist as he listened. Shame and an unnamed anxiety washed over him. A couple of days after talking to Aaron, Mark mustered the nerve to drive by his old house. The yard was overgrown with weeds, shutters closed. A faded for sale sign hung crookedly. Through the dusty window, he could make out the shapes of old furniture. He remembered how once the living room had burst with laughter and candlelit dinners, how they dreamed of having kids. Now it looked abandoned. One evening, Mark decided to call Alice's sister. At the mention of his name, there was a tense silence on the other end. Then came a startled, worried voice. Mark? You should know, Alice took it really hard after that fight. She blames herself, but also you, the voice said. A note of reproach but not outright hostility. Maybe you two should talk. He couldn't respond right away, because hearing she blames herself, but also you, hit his conscience. Yes, he had reached a terrifying extreme, but he still felt that Alice had wronged him first. Can I see her? He finally murmured. Her sister reluctantly agreed to arrange a meeting. Mark spent the night wide awake, imagining how it would go, dreading reopening old wounds, but knowing he couldn't hide forever. It was time to face what he'd been running from. They met the next day in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, early in the morning when it was usually quiet. Mark arrived first, taking a seat by the window that overlooked a deserted street. His heart pounded wildly, palms sweating around his cup of coffee. When the door opened, Alice stepped inside. She looked changed, thinner, more haggard, her eyes red despite the makeup. It was obvious she'd gone through immense hardship over the past year. Approaching his table, she sat across from him. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds before Alice broke it, her voice quiet and hesitant. Hi, Mark. I never thought I'd see you again. He wanted to say something harsh. Resentment still burned in him. But no words came. He saw a broken woman in front of him, and his anger receded. Hi, he finally said. I'm not sure what to say. Alice sighed softly, lowering her gaze. Neither am I. I made an unforgivable mistake. When you left, everything just fell apart. She described how relatives tried to help her and how an investigation had briefly started after he disappeared and the police were called to the house. Eventually the case was dropped, partly because Derek himself never pursued charges. He must have feared public scandal. But rumors spread among their acquaintances and coworkers, wrecking Alice's career. She lost her job, buckling under stress. Unable to pay the mortgage alone, she'd had to put the house up for sale. Yes, I had an affair, she said dully, and yes, I'm at fault. I destroyed us. You. I don't even know why I did it. Now I live with this guilt. Mark struggled to listen. The question echoed in his mind. How could you do this? But he saw how frail and remorseful she seemed, and realized that his vengeance had already landed its blow. She had lost everything. And so had he. I blamed you for it all, he said at last. But I also realized my rage was monstrous. I shouldn't have resorted to violence. And yet, I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Alice sniffled, closing her eyes as though ready to accept his verdict. I'm not asking you to. It's unforgivable. But please say we can both keep living. Somehow. After that first encounter at the cafe, Mark and Alice began occasionally talking brief, tense conversations that reopened old wounds. They didn't try to rebuild what was lost, but sought a way to deal with the scars. Initially, their interactions were strained, the weight of the past looming over every word. Yet they persisted, needing some closure despite the pain. One afternoon, they met on a bench in a quiet park. The trees swayed in a gentle breeze. It was their first time venturing out in public since their reconciliation attempts began. Mark broke the silence in a steady but reflective tone. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive you, Alice. What happened? It changed me. Alice nodded, eyes on the ground. I understand. I'm not expecting forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm trying to make things right, even if it can't fix what I did. They sat quietly, both thinking about how the last year had scarred them and how uncertain healing still seemed. Yet both recognized that acknowledging the pain was better than ignoring it altogether. In the weeks that followed, they continued to meet, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to walk. Gradually, their conversation shifted from the tormenting past to more mundane, everyday topics. It was a slow, cautious process, as though they were carefully circling the charred ruins of their old life, searching for a single safe path through. Months passed. One day, Mark unexpectedly ran into Derek in the city, near a small park. They practically collided as Mark was heading to the bus stop and Derek was hurrying by. They recognized each other immediately. Fear flared in Derek's eyes, as if he might bolt. "Wait," Mark said in a low voice, though his heart hammered. "I'm not going to hit you." Derek managed a hesitant smile, a faint scar visible over his left brow, remnants of that night. I didn't mean to get into someone else's marriage," he blurted. "When you disappeared, people thought you'd be arrested, or worse. And I felt ashamed." To Mark's surprise, his own hands unclenched. A year ago, he might have killed this man without blinking. Now here he was, just a guy who made bad choices, no arrogance, no contempt. Mark nodded. "It's in the past," he replied. "You can forget about it." Derek's eyes widened. He clearly hadn't expected that. They exchanged a few awkward words, then each went his own way. Mark sensed a strange relief, as if another boulder had rolled from his soul. About 6 months after Mark's return, he and Alice met again at the same cafe. This time, there was less tension. They quietly talked about the future. They had filed divorce papers, both recognizing there was no way to restore their old bond. Yet in a strange way, they were closer in their mutual understanding than during the final months of their marriage. "I'm leaving this city," Mark admitted, stirring his coffee. "Maybe I'll move to the next state, find a job, start over. I don't want to keep running blindly, but I can't stay here, stuck with these memories." Alice nodded. "I'm leaving too," she said softly. "A friend of mine, Kate, wants me to move in with her and is helping me find a new job. I realized my mistake. I want to grow, figure myself out." They sat there, recalling the terrors that had torn them apart, but also recognizing that each of them still had a spark of decency and humanity. Once, they had loved each other. Infidelity and violence had crushed that love, but they could at least acknowledge each other's humanity again. Saying goodbye that night, Mark awkwardly hugged Alice, and she pressed her face to his shoulder. Tears of regret shone in her eyes. His expression mirrored a quiet sadness. But no one pleaded for a reunion or hurled accusations. 2 weeks later, Mark left the city. His car was crammed with a few possessions. Most had been claimed by the bank or left in the old house. Still, he carried boxes of books, a laptop, tools for electronics repair, and a handful of keepsakes. He also carried photographs from his old life, images he had nearly thrown away in a panic but then decided to keep. Among them was their wedding photo, where he and Alice gazed at each other, smiling as though they owned the world. Now the road led him to a new place he planned to settle, cutting the last ties to the past. He knew the mental scars would stay with him, but he believed he could forge a future free of lingering bitterness. He drove for several hours before stopping at a small roadside motel to continue the trip the next day. After checking in, he entered a plain room with a metal bed and a heavily curtained window. He hesitated, then pulled out one of his old photos. He and Alice in the first month of marriage, happily laughing on a beach. Mark gazed at the picture and felt as though he were looking at two different people who no longer existed. He understood he still had to come to terms with his guilt and rage, but deep inside he was resolute about moving forward with his life. There would be no running away in fear anymore. Mark rented a small, bright apartment in the new city, with windows overlooking a tree-lined street. He found work at an electronics repair shop where an acquaintance had once offered him a job. The small team welcomed him warmly, and the owner, Colin, immediately noticed Mark's skillful hands and steady approach. Early on, Mark was shy and withdrawn, not socializing much or talking about his past. But as people showed him trust, he slowly relaxed. He began sharing small jokes, joined them for coffee breaks, and discussed soccer matches. Gradually, he started feeling like a part of the team again. Occasionally, the past still haunted him. He'd recall that horrific day, his fists clenched, his breath grew uneven. But he learned to calm himself, telling himself it was over. He also voluntarily continued seeing a local counselor, sorting through the emotional aftermath of betrayal and violence. Reading about psychological coping strategies helped him navigate his deep personal crisis. A year went by, and life settled into a steady routine, shadowed by this unspoken history of betrayal and violence. Then, one evening, Mark's phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. "I forgive you." No signature, but he knew instantly who it was from. His heart clenched. "I forgive you," he exhaled and, to his own surprise, gave a shaky laugh mixed with tears. Apparently, Alice had mustered the courage to write. He stared at the words on the small screen, feeling that a locked door was finally beginning to open. Over the past year, they had exchanged a few short messages, mostly about formalities, divorce paperwork, selling the house, closing joint accounts, but never about forgiveness. He didn't know how to respond. That night he couldn't sleep, replaying the memories of their life together and its violent end. Although their roads had diverged, although they were different people now, these words might be the closing of one chapter, or the start of something calm, separate, and free from resentment. A couple of days later, Mark found the courage to call the number. Alice answered. Her voice held a calm he hadn't heard in years. They talked for nearly an hour. She had indeed moved in with her friend, found a new job, and was slowly rebuilding her life. She said she sometimes thought of him with gratitude for the good years they shared before it all fell apart. "I realize we both messed up," Alice admitted. "But that's all in the past. I'm glad you've moved on." Mark felt a bittersweet relief. "I'm glad things are working out for you. We were close once." He hung up the phone and realized he felt lighter. While anger and heartbreak don't vanish without a trace, they become part of a shared history. He realized he could carry on without letting it corrode his soul. Several more months passed. One evening, Mark left the repair shop, locking the doors behind him. The city around him eased into twilight. As usual, he walked home, enjoying the cool air and the glow of the street lamps. He felt peaceful. Once, he had run away in despair, thinking he had lost everything. But life went on. He had a new job, a simple apartment, and a sense of inner peace he never had, not even in what he once considered happy marital years. He had learned to respect himself, not allowing rage to dominate his character. The saga with Alice, her infidelity and his furious response, had taught him how crucial trust and honesty are, both toward others and to oneself. That evening, Mark arrived home, made tea, and opened the window to the night breeze. He glanced at his phone, running a finger over Alice's last message. But he didn't write back. There was nothing more to say. He was free from old chains, finally ready to move forward. Reflecting on everything, the violence and fury, and the quiet acceptance that came later, he understood his past would always remain. Yet it no longer held power over him. He had learned to forgive Alice, himself, and the circumstances that destroyed their marriage. He stepped onto the small balcony, inhaling the fragrance of night-blooming flowers, and closed his eyes. Somewhere in another city lived a woman he'd once loved, who had caused him pain and suffered as well. That chapter was finished. What lay ahead was unknown, but he no longer felt fear or thirst for revenge, only a quiet acceptance of himself and his new life. He recognized that anyone can fall victim to fate's harsh blows, and any fairy tale can turn into tragedy. Yet if you find the strength not to be consumed by rage and despair, even after the worst mistakes, a new dawn is possible, though it might look nothing like the dreams you once had. Mark smiled, gazing at the city lights. He still bore scars on his soul and in his memories. But he was moving forward, and every morning, opening his eyes, he would tell himself, "I'm alive. I can breathe, and I won't let the past destroy my future." That's the end of our story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on new stories and share this video so others can discover these great stories too.